Hey, welcome back, and you just got to hear about the Robbers Cave experiment, and now we're going to talk a little bit about groupthink. Not related to Robbers Cave, but something similar when it comes to social psychology. So think about the term Mr. Davis mentioned in a previous video. Psychology terms kind of define themselves. Groupthink. The group thinks similarly. So what happens in groupthink? There's a desire for harmony, and there's a bad decision that's going on. Group loyalty is more important than good choices. So a group gets together, they make a bad decision because everybody wants to get along with each other. You can do this by suppressing dissenting viewpoints if you have a leader who's kind of a top-down person who says, this is the way I want it done. Or if you isolate yourself, and we're going to talk a little bit more about isolation, and we do this in a lot of ways without even realizing it. We make bad decisions because we are isolated. Not necessarily physically isolated, but you'll see in a minute. And then some of the great examples are the Bay of Pigs. You had a bunch of guys from Harvard, a bunch of white guys from Harvard, led by John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, and they got in a room and they said, like they do from Harvard, oh, I think it'd be a wonderful idea to invade Cuba because they would welcome us as liberators, because that's how people from Harvard talk. So they went there. It was a complete fiasco, almost comical how bad it was. Nobody even died. That's how terrible it was. It was like we walked up on shore and the Cubans said, come here, we're going to arrest you. And we're like, okay. So why was it a bad idea? Because it was a bunch of people who wanted to please the president, and there was nobody from the outside helping to make decisions. Vietnam, very similar. How do we keep making terrible decisions, getting further and further into Vietnam? Because we had a leader that we wanted to please and a whole bunch of people from similar backgrounds. Challenger disaster. What happened with Challenger? There are these O-rings that couldn't survive the cold, and there were people saying these O-rings won't survive the cold, hello, but all these people said, well, we gotta launch. So they got in a group and they made a bad decision. That is groupthink. And it's sort of related, and I'm going to move my video up so you can see this whole thing, sort of related to the false consensus effect. And take a look at that again and see the term defines itself. Consensus means everybody agrees, but it's false. We think everybody agrees with us. In our own minds, we say, well, if I think it, that's probably what everybody else is thinking. I'm a rational person, and I think this, so doesn't every rational person think this? So we have this belief that if we believe it, everybody else does. We get into a group, and we just don't have the courage or whatever it is required to put our hand up and say, I think this is not a good idea. Here's some things we should think about. So let's take a look at what it is and how we might combat groupthink. But first, let's take a look. What's the difference between group polarization, which Mr. Davis talked about in a previous video, and groupthink? Here's group polarization. On the internet, let's say I'm a Republican, all I see is Fox News, all I see is Daily Stormer or whatever else, all these other things, and I get more and more extreme to one side. I'm a Democrat, I see CNN, I see all these other things, MSNBC, I get more toward the Democratic side. Think of polarization like the North and South Pole. That's as far away as you can get from each other on the Earth, the North and South Pole. So group polarization, the more Republicans get together, the more they go here, the more Democrats get together, the more they go out here. So we're getting further and further apart. In groupthink, we are coming together. We are a group that all thinks the same thing, or even if we don't, we just go along because what's most important is group loyalty. And then we take a look at conformity in groupthink. In conformity, there's no leader, and there's no really decision to be made. If bell bottoms came back, we'd probably just start wearing them again, because that's what we do. That's conformity. Groupthink is we have a leader, we come to a decision, and we all of our decisions sort of rally around this leader. What do we see with groupthink? What sorts of things might lead to groupthink? Well, first of all, isolation. And when I say isolation, I don't necessarily mean geographically. It can be any other type of isolation. Let's look. Actually, I'm going to back up. So I want to stay with isolation for a second. You can be isolated ideologically. Actually, we'll get to that coming up in a bit, so I'll just skip it. High group cohesiveness. If you're a Democrat, you are blue and you have a mascot that's a donkey. If you're a Republican, you're red and you have a mascot that is an elephant. So you're very, very cohesive in that way. Authoritarian leadership. When I say authoritarian, maybe it's a little bit too much. Authoritarian means top down. I'm going to tell you what to do, like dictatorship. It doesn't necessarily have to be that strong, but if you have a very strong leader who everybody wants to please, that's going to lead to everybody saying whatever the dear leader says. Similarity of social background. That was what I was kind of trying to get with isolation. If you have a bunch of white guys, actually if you have a bunch of any type person together, it just so happens that historically in our country it's been a bunch of white guys. They only have one background. They haven't thought of other things. What they find is having one woman on a board of any corporation leads to so much better decisions, leads to a lot more profit because they're not isolated. So anytime you can get dissenting opinions, not even dissenting, different opinions, you should seek out different opinions, otherwise you're going to make bad decisions. High stress from external threats. Obviously communism was for Bay of Pigs in Vietnam. Weirdly, in the Challenger disaster, it was the weather, because every time they were trying to launch something bad would happen with the weather. So finally, when they had a window that was open, that was their chance. And then lack of norms for making decisions. Robert's Rules of Order, they use that in Congress. They basically say, here's how all those in favor say aye, all those opposed nay, whatever it is, you have to have rules. Because if there are no rules, guess who makes up the rules? This person right here. So there needs to be very clear decision-making rules in order to avoid groupthink. And when you think about it, I keep bringing up politics, but any caucus where they isolate themselves, it's a whole bunch of people who already agree, maybe similarity of backgrounds, they just don't make the best decisions. They rally around a decision that's probably what their leader wants and maybe not what's best. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about prejudice and discrimination, and let's take a look at this word. Pre means before, you know that. J-U-D comes from judge, so it's a prejudgment, and a judgment is a thought. It's not an action, it's a thought. So prejudice is a thought. If I look at somebody and I judge them immediately, I judge them based on their hair color or their skin color or whatever else, that's a prejudice. Now, I can have a prejudice and not necessarily discriminate, although that's kind of hard. But a discrimination is when you actually do something against that person. You don't give them a job because of the group they belong to. You don't let them rent your house to them because of the group that they belong to. That's discrimination. That's illegal. Prejudice, you can't legislate against thoughts, but you can legislate against discrimination. Equal opportunity employment, all that other stuff. So know the difference. Prejudice often leads to discrimination, but discrimination is the action that does a lot of harm. And when we're dealing with prejudice and discrimination, we're going to have an in-group and we're going to have an out-group. We're going to have a group that says, this is me, this is us together, and we separate ourselves from that group over there. That's the out-group. And then the other group, that might be their in-group and we're the out-group, whatever. But how do we know? How do we know who's a member of the in-group or the out-group? One of the things that we need is social distance. There has to be, we have to say, what makes us similar and what makes them different? There's the other race effect, and you're going to see that in the book. And just go ahead and read about it in the book. There's a great portion about that in there. What's the easiest way for me to tell the difference between my group and somebody else's group? From a distance. One of the best ways is skin color. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying, why do we have so much racial discrimination? Because it's easy. I can see that person is a member of, not a member of my group in that way. So that's one of the reasons we have so much racial discrimination. But what happens if we want to discriminate against somebody? We want to find an out-group, but we can't tell the difference between us and them. What do we do? What did the Germans do during World War II? And when I say we, obviously I don't want to do that. I'm just saying humans. What do humans do? Germany, World War II, they wanted to tell the difference between Germans and the Jewish people, and they said, we really can't tell from sight. How do we do it? We force them to wear the armbands with the Star of David on it, so that way I can tell from a distance I'm not that person. So think about that. As soon as I'm starting to draw lines between my group and their group and make it very obvious with an armband or whatever else, that's where we might start getting into some bad stuff, some prejudice and discrimination. Gosh, I'm already almost 9 minutes long. All right, I'm going to end the video.